Thank you all for joining. This is Locals Only, Patterns and Anti-Patterns in OpenTofu around local values. A little bit about me. I am a new entrepreneur. I've recently founded Copacetic Inc. I do some consulting work through Glennium. I used to work for Accenture, and that's where I gained a lot of these skills. I have a blog that I often write about Terraform or now Tofu. I have a forthcoming book and a podcast that I'm going to be starting. Just to give a little bit of a overview, we're going to first define what local values are. I assume everybody here knows, but just for completeness, we'll talk about some successful use of some successful patterns, and then go into a few anti-patterns, and then I'll end on some other considerations when it comes to local values. All right, so what they are, very quickly, they're named objects that are not resources. You can reuse them. They're defined in locals blocks, and they're referenced under the local object by their name. They're great for, providing extra flexibility, reusing values, or imposing a standard format. They're really great for reducing repetition, or providing abstraction. They can also kind of introduce unnecessary complexity if they're not treated, like code. So in terms of some successful use, I mentioned standardized formatting. There might be a format for your naming convention, for example, for resources that might include your business unit or the application name, or even just the purpose of the resource itself. It's useful for reducing repetition. You may have multiple resources that have similar names, and to be able to parameterize the portion that is variable or similar is really valuable. And doing that outside of variables or outside of the resource definitions, and doing it in locals can provide a great deal of clarity without muddying up the definitions. As you have your resources get more and more complex, this becomes just imperative to pull that complexity out into locals. All of this is pretty clear. Let's look at examples of anti-patterns. This comes up, I think, a lot. The first one is probably not super common, but it happens, especially on maybe younger teams. It's the standard format is to use a single resource.tf, a single locals.tf, etc. Sometimes when maybe teams are owning their own resources and we don't have a great deal of validation sitting on top of that, we may see some variation, such as like a compute.tf, a storage.tf. And on top of that, we may see locals blocks actually defined in those resource definitions near it kind of makes sense. You want to use your locals near the resources that consume them, except when you have multiple locals blocks, if anything is named similarly, it's unclear what it's going to be until we get to runtime and you plan it out and actually see what's going to come out. So the mitigation, of course, is to use the standard format, single locals file. The next one is not inherently problematic, but it definitely can reduce clarity. If you're mixing your local definition or your local values with just inline code logic, whether that's string manipulation or other things, you're already defining a locals or a local value. Define the one that you need for that field. I would recommend just minimizing the use of inline logic as much as possible. There are obvious cases for using for each or count, as mentioned in some of the other talks. But minimizing this as much as possible and pulling that all into the locals is going to greatly improve your readability. This one I've come across a couple times. This is really bizarre. Trying to enforce some kind of like type safety or defaults outside of the actual values that control that, and maybe creating multiple variables. One's the real default and is disallowed to, like, you can't make updates to it in the TF-vars. Maybe there's some like validation on top of it, or Git hooks that like will reject a build if you're trying to set those. And then you have like all this logic in the locals to try and figure out which is the right variable. Just like, don't do that. Trust, use the default, the value type definitions. It's underutilized unless you're creating like publicly available modules. I almost never see them, but invest in them. They're very useful. And then, of course, just excessively nested logic, just like things that are completely unintelligible. This is actually pretty simple compared to what I've seen. I think a lot of people come from, to infrastructure as code from the infrastructure side. But, there's some really, keep things simple, single responsibility principle. Just pull out all of those operations into their own value, name them, use a self-documenting approach that's going to avoid any confusion. Frankly, when I come across those nested things, I just don't, I have to ignore them. I have to move on, or I have to refactor them so I can understand what the heck is going on. All right, some other considerations. I mentioned modules before. Modules are a perfect place to use locals. You can really greatly reduce your input surface area by, exposing only a few variables and letting your locals, construct additional ones. Or even, it does reduce flexibility, but it can create very rich modules that don't have 1,000 variables to set. It also is useful for especially if you have like internal modules that you expose and you want to enforce maybe an operating system distribution or a boot disk size or something like that. You can hard code those values in locals. I recommend not doing it in the resource definitions themselves. At least if you do it in locals, you're parameterizing it, and it's a single place that you can go back and change it in the future. Outputs are, probably everybody's familiar with resource attributes. If you're referencing one resource in another, you're already using them. Outputting those attributes can be really useful for just collecting all of the useful information at the end of a plan or a build. It's also really great to expose your locals. You can troubleshoot them that way. You can just see what's going into your resource definitions without having to go back and look through the plan and trying to gather all of that information. Finally, I would just say with outputs, sometimes you see a lot of complexity or a lot of logic in the output definitions themselves. If you're just doing like a splat from a for each or something like that and outputting an array of IDs or something, then fine. But if you're doing kind of standard formatting in the output, it's worth pulling those into locals. There's nothing wrong with having a local value that is intended only to be output. All right. With that, what questions do you have? Clearly, I was extremely clear. That's my contact information. The QR code there, it goes to a site with some of my projects. The form on it doesn't work yet. It should work later today, but it doesn't yet. This is the QR code for my feedback if you want to give me feedback on this talk. Thank you.